Hi, I am Sophia. Welcome to True Payback, where story hits different. Hit subscribe. Let's dive in.
There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a Thanksgiving table when a father decides his daughter is the entertainment. I had felt that silence every year for as long as I could remember. The moment conversation shifted, the moment eyes moved toward me, the moment my father cleared his throat and found his opening. Some families argue about politics. Some argue about religion. Mine argued about whether I was a liar. My name is Danielle Mercer. I am 31 years old. And for the better part of a decade, my family believed, genuinely, completely, without question, that I had fabricated my entire professional life. It started the way most family myths start, with a single comment that went unchallenged. I was 22, fresh out of college with a computer science degree from a school my father considered second tier. And I told my family at Christmas dinner that I had accepted a position at a financial technology startup in Austin. My father, Richard Mercer, put down his glass and looked at me the way he looked at things he found vaguely irritating, like slow traffic and incorrect change. A startup, he repeated. Yes, I said. It's a payments infrastructure company. Early stage, but the founders have strong. So you don't have a real job. That was it. That was the sentence that became the foundation of everything that followed. Not a real job. And because no one at that table pushed back, not my mother Carol, not my older brother Derek, not my uncle Bill who laughed at everything my father said because it was easier than disagreeing, it became the family's official position. Danielle does not have a real job. Over the next 9 years the story evolved. The startup grew. I was promoted. I was brought in as a co-founder when the original team restructured. We raised a Series A, then a Series B, then a Series C that valued the company at $175 million. I was featured in Forbes 30 Under 30 in 2021. I was quoted in the Wall Street Journal twice. My face appeared in a TechCrunch profile with the headline, "The Quiet Architect of Austin's FinTech Revolution." My family knew none of this. Not because I hid it from them, I mentioned it. I mentioned it carefully, in measured doses, the way you introduce information to people who have already decided not to believe you. But my father had established the narrative early, and narratives, once established in families, are almost impossible to overturn from the inside. Every promotion I mentioned became fabrication. Every award became delusion. Every raise became further evidence that I was spinning an elaborate fantasy to compensate for my obvious failure. Danielle lives in her own world, my mother would say, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. She's always been dramatic, Derek would agree. Remember when she said she was going to be a software engineer? Uncle Bill would add, and the table would laugh because apparently the funniest possible outcome was that I had actually done what I said I was going to do. I stopped correcting them around year 4. Not because I gave up, but because I had learned something important about family dynamics. Some battles are not won through argument. They are won through evidence. And evidence requires patience. Evidence requires waiting for the moment the other side hands you the stage. I did not know, sitting at Thanksgiving the year I was 28, that my father was already planning to hand me exactly that. Before I explain what my father did, you need to understand Derek. My brother Derek Mercer is 4 years older than me and has spent his entire adult life being everything my father wanted me to be. He went to my father's alma mater. He joined my father's industry. Financial consulting, regional firms, the kind of work that sounds impressive at dinner parties and moves slowly enough that ambition rarely becomes inconvenient. He married a woman named Bethany who laughed at my father's jokes and remembered the names of his golf partners. He bought a house 12 minutes from my parents. He called every Sunday. Derek was not a bad person. I want to be precise about that because what I am about to describe could make him sound like a villain, and the truth is more complicated. Derek was a man who had organized his entire identity around his father's approval, which meant that anything threatening to Richard Mercer's worldview was, by extension, threatening to Derek. And I, with my startup and my equity and my conference keynotes, was a permanent low-grade threat. It was Derek who, 3 years before the Thanksgiving in question, first suggested to my father that I might be exaggerating my professional success. I know this because my cousin Jess, who is the only member of my extended family I trust, told me about the conversation. Apparently Derek had mentioned at a family dinner I had not attended that he had looked into my company and found the public information inconsistent with what I claimed. What Derek had actually done, Jess told me, was search the company name, find our minimal public-facing profile. We were deliberately low profile for competitive reasons, and conclude that limited public information meant limited reality. It was the logic of a man who had never worked in an industry that valued discretion over visibility. My father, who had spent 40 years in a field where reputation was currency and a handshake meant something, found Derek's concern entirely reasonable. After that dinner, the family consensus hardened from "Danielle exaggerates" to "Danielle is lying." It was a meaningful upgrade in hostility. The following year, my father asked me point blank at Christmas to show him proof of my employment. I told him my offer letter and company equity documentation were confidential. He told me that convenient. I told him I understood his skepticism and was sorry I couldn't share sensitive business documents at a holiday dinner. He told me that was exactly what someone making things up would say. My mother suggested we open presents. That was 2 years before The Investigator. While my family constructed their narrative about my fictional career, I was, in fact, building something real. PayVault Technologies, the company I had joined at 22 as employee number 7, had grown from a 12-person Austin operation into a significant player in embedded financial infrastructure. We built the invisible architecture that allowed non-financial businesses to offer banking services to their customers. If you had ever opened a mobile bank account through a retail app, a healthcare platform, or a gig economy service, there was a reasonable chance our technology was running underneath it. I had joined as a junior software engineer. By 25, I was leading our security and compliance division. By 27, when our 3 original founders decided to restructure the executive team and bring in operational leadership with equity positions, I was one of 2 people they chose. Marcus Webb, who had been with the company since month 3, became our CEO. I became co-founder, chief product officer, and holder of 8.3% equity in a company that, at our Series C, was valued at $175 million. 8.3% of $175 million is a number that makes a dinner fork drop. I did not live extravagantly. This was partly strategic. I had watched enough founder stories collapse under the weight of lifestyle inflation before liquidity, and partly because I genuinely did not care much about visible wealth. I drove a 4-year-old Subaru. I rented a good apartment in East Austin rather than buying in the hills. I wore the same rotation of clean, unremarkable clothes to family events that I wore everywhere else. I did not mention my equity at family dinners. I did not forward the Forbes article. I did not suggest anyone Google my name. I was watching. I was waiting. And I was documenting everything. The voicemails my father left when he'd had 2 glasses of wine. The ones where he told me I was an embarrassment. The text messages from Derek saying I needed to come clean about my fake job before I humiliated the whole family. The Christmas card from my mother that said in her careful looping handwriting that she and my father were worried about my grip on reality and thought I should consider speaking to someone. I saved every one of them. I kept them in a folder on a personal hard drive and in cloud backup. Not out of bitterness, or not only out of bitterness, out of a quiet, steady certainty that someday the truth would need evidence, and that I would be the one providing it. Marcus, my CEO and one of my closest friends, knew about my family. He found the situation somewhere between baffling and infuriating. "You know, I'll fly to whatever dinner table you need," he told me once, over tacos in our usual spot on South Congress. "Say the word and I'll show up in the Forbes jacket." I told him I appreciated it. I told him it wasn't time yet. He asked me how I would know when it was time. I told him I'd know because they would hand it to me. 13 months before the Thanksgiving that ended everything, my father hired a private investigator named Gerald Holt. I know the details of this because Gerald Holt told me himself later, and because his billing records became part of the legal documentation that followed. My father paid a $3,500 retainer, with a final invoice of $10,200 total. Gerald Holt had 23 years of investigative experience, including 11 years with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division before he went private. He was thorough, methodical, and, as it turned out, professionally obligated in ways my father had not considered when he wrote the check. My father's stated objective, according to the engagement letter Gerald showed me, was to verify or disprove the professional claims made by subject Danielle R. Mercer, including but not limited to employment status, company co-founder claims, equity holdings, and award recognitions. He wanted documentation. He wanted something concrete he could put on the table and say, "Here it is. Here is the proof that your daughter has been lying to us for 9 years." He got documentation. Just not the documentation he expected. What my father did not know, what no one in my family knew, was that Gerald Holt operated under a professional standard that required him to flag any potentially illegal activity he discovered in the course of an investigation, including activity involving individuals adjacent to the primary subject. This was not a legal requirement in every jurisdiction. It was Gerald's personal professional code, developed during his FBI years, and it was written into his engagement contracts in paragraph 7, which my father had signed without reading carefully. Paragraph 7 would prove to be the most expensive page my father ever skimmed. Gerald spent 45 days on my case. He verified my employment. He verified my co-founder status. He verified the Forbes recognition, the Wall Street Journal quotes, the TechCrunch profile, the Series C valuation. He obtained public financial disclosures through legal channels, cross-referenced with company registrations, and assembled a profile that he later told me was one of the cleanest subject files he had ever prepared. There was nothing to dig for, he said. Everything checked out on the first pass. Then he moved to the adjacent parties as his contract required. He looked at Derek first, as Derek had apparently been mentioned in my father's briefing as a concerned family member, whose credibility my father wanted established. Gerald pulled Derek's professional history, his business registrations, his financial disclosures. He found what he found. He documented it carefully. He moved on to my father. What Gerald found in my father's financial history I did not know at the time. I would learn it like everyone else at Thanksgiving. Gerald Holt called my father in October to schedule the report presentation. My father, apparently still confident, decided to make it an event. He would present the findings at Thanksgiving, he told Gerald. The whole family would be there. It would be the moment of final, definitive exposure. Gerald said he would attend. He did not tell my father what was in the second folder. I drove to my parents' house on Thanksgiving morning knowing nothing about what was coming. My cousin Jess had texted me the night before. "Just a heads up, your dad is planning something with some kind of investigator?" But I had no specifics. I had long since stopped being surprised by my family's escalations, and I arrived the way I always arrived. Calm, quiet, carrying a pie I had ordered from a bakery because I had learned years ago that homemade contributions were criticized and store-bought ones were accepted without comment. My mother hugged me briefly at the door. Derek and Bethany were already in the living room. Derek gave me the nod that substituted in our family for warmth. My Aunt Patricia and Uncle Bill were at the kitchen island, Bill already on his second beer at 11 in the morning. My grandmother, Nora, was at her usual chair by the window, the only person in the room I genuinely loved being around. Jess, her daughter, shot me a look when I walked in that I filed away. And there, seated in the formal dining room with a briefcase and a glass of water, was a man I had never met. "Danielle," my father said from across the room, and his voice carried that particular register, controlled satisfaction like a man who has been waiting. "We have a guest today." "I can see that," I said. "Gerald Holt. He's been doing some research." My father smiled. I thought it would be good for the family to hear what he found. I set the pie down on the kitchen counter and walked to the dining room. I shook Gerald Holt's hand. He held my gaze for half a second longer than the handshake required, and in that half second something passed between us that I could not quite name. Not sympathy exactly, but something close to it. Acknowledgement, maybe. "Ms. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Holt," I said. I sat down at my usual seat, the one at the far end farthest from my father, and waited. The meal was functional. Turkey, sides, the routine of passing dishes, and the performance of family normalcy that Thanksgiving demands even from families who have scheduled ambushes for the dessert course. Uncle Bill made 3 jokes. My grandmother asked me about Austin. Bethany described a renovation project in detail that no one had requested. My father ate with the contained energy of a man saving himself. Halfway through the meal he stood up. "I want to say something," he said. The table quieted. "I want everyone here for this," he said, "because I think it's important for our family to have honesty. Real honesty. For too long, we've had one member of this family telling stories about her career that none of us have been able to verify." He looked at me. So I took action. I paid a professional to get to the truth. Uncle Bill laughed. I stayed quiet. "Gerald," my father said, The floor is yours. Gerald Holt stood. He was a compact man mid-50s, with the unhurried physical presence of someone who had spent decades delivering information that changed people's lives. He set his briefcase on the table and opened it without ceremony. "Thank you, Richard," he said. "I want to be transparent with this family before I present my findings. I was hired to investigate one subject. Per my standard professional practice, which is disclosed in all my engagement contracts, I conducted due diligence on adjacent parties as warranted. In this case, I investigated 3 individuals." He paused. "I will present my findings in the order they were requested." He reached into the briefcase. He placed one folder in front of me. "Danielle Rose Mercer," he said. Age 31. Co-founder and Chief Product Officer of PayVault Technologies, Austin, Texas. Company valuation as of Series C funding, $175 million. Subject's equity position, 8.3%. Verified. He let that sit for a moment. Additionally, Forbes 30 Under 30 2021 FinTech category. Wall Street Journal quoted twice, 2022 and 2023. TechCrunch profile March 2022. Patent co-holder on 3 financial security innovations registered with the USPTO. He closed the folder. Everything claimed by the subject is verified and documented. The table had gone very still. My grandmother made a small sound that might have been a laugh. My father's jaw had tightened, but he had not moved. He was recalibrating. I could see it happening in real time. The story he had built, the confidence he had carried into this room, adjusting to accommodate facts it had not expected. "Now," Gerald said, and he turned to my father. He placed the second folder down. Dad's fork dropped. Gerald Holt did not rush. That was the thing I remember most clearly about the next 4 minutes. He did not perform urgency or drama. He simply read his findings the way he had read mine, in the same measured voice, with the same factual precision. "Richard Thomas Mercer," he said. Age 63. Financial consultant, Mercer Advisory Group, LLC. He opened the folder. In the course of verifying adjacent financial records, I identified a pattern of transactions that warranted further investigation. Specifically, between 2018 and 2023, approximately $340,000 in client funds were moved through a series of shell accounts registered to LLCs with no active business operations. These transactions are inconsistent with standard fee structures and were not disclosed to the clients in question. My father said, "That's..." "I'm not finished," Gerald said, and my father stopped. Additionally, I identified Derek Allen Mercer, age 35, in connection with 2 of the same LLC registrations. Mr. Derek Mercer appears as registered agent on both entities. The timeline of registration corresponds to the period in which he worked directly under his father's advisory firm. Gerald turned to Derek. "That documentation is in the 3rd section of the report." Derek's chair scraped back from the table. Bethany put her hand on his arm. My mother said, "Richard, what is he?" "These findings," Gerald continued, "were required by my professional obligations to be disclosed. I have already filed a preliminary notification with the Texas State Securities Board, as required by statute when a licensed investigator encounters evidence of securities fraud. A copy of the full report was transmitted to their office this morning." He closed the folder. "I wanted to present these findings to the family first as a courtesy. The board will be in contact." The room was completely silent. My Uncle Bill had put down his beer. My grandmother was looking at my father with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not shock exactly, but a kind of grief, the look of someone watching something they had suspected for a long time become confirmed. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and said nothing. My father turned to me, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen there in 31 years of being his daughter. Not apology, not quite, but the specific look of a man who understands in a single terrible moment the full weight of what he has done. He had spent $10,000 in a year of planning to expose me. He had assembled his family, set his table, introduced his investigator. And he had handed me everything. "Danielle," he started. I said quietly, "that you should call a lawyer." The 48 hours after Thanksgiving were the kind that rearrange a family's geography permanently. Gerald Holt left within the hour. Before he went, he paused beside me in the hallway and said, "I want you to know I did everything I could to present this professionally." I told him I believed him. I told him I appreciated it. I meant both things. My father called 2 lawyers before Friday morning. The first was a criminal defense attorney named Patterson who took a $25,000 retainer over the phone. The second was a civil attorney his firm had used for contract disputes who told him, after reviewing Gerald's preliminary findings, that the situation was significantly more serious than a contract dispute. Derek drove home that night without speaking to anyone. Bethany texted me at 11 p.m. I do not know what she was hoping I would say. I did not respond. My mother called me on Friday afternoon. She was crying, which was not in itself unusual, but the quality of the crying was different. Not manipulative, not performative, which were the 2 varieties I had learned to identify over the years. It was the crying of someone who was genuinely lost. "I didn't know," she said. "I believe you," I said. "About any of it. Not the money. Not," she stopped. "Not about you either. I should have." "Mom," I said. "I know." We stayed on the phone for a while without saying much. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had, and it was mostly silence. My cousin Jess texted me that evening. "You okay?" I told her I was better than I'd been in a long time. The Texas State Securities Board investigation moved with the slow, grinding inevitability that all regulatory actions move. Over the following 4 months, it expanded. The original $340,000 figure grew as forensic accountants traced additional transactions through the LLC network. The final number, which appeared in the civil complaint filed in March, was $612,000 across 9 client accounts over 6 years. My father was not a monster. I want to say that plainly because the temptation when telling a story like this is to flatten people into their worst actions, and my father was more than his worst actions. He was also a man who had coached my youth soccer team and made the best scrambled eggs I had ever eaten and sat with me once, when I was 9 and frightened, through an entire thunderstorm without saying a single impatient word. He was a man who had made terrible decisions that hurt people who had trusted him, and who was now living inside the consequences of those decisions. But he was also the man who had told me for 9 years that my career was a fantasy, who had spent $10,000 trying to prove I was a liar, who had assembled my family in his dining room for what he intended to be my humiliation. Those things were also true. Both could be true simultaneously. I had learned, over 31 years, to hold the complexity without letting it confuse me about what was real. My father received a civil settlement requirement of $612,000 in client restitution, paid through the liquidation of the advisory firm and the refinancing of my parents' home. His financial consulting license was revoked. He avoided criminal prosecution. His attorney negotiated skillfully, and the clients, most of whom simply wanted their money back, agreed not to pursue criminal referrals once the civil process was completed. Derek was removed from the LLC registrations prior to the formal complaint, a legal maneuver his attorney executed quickly enough to keep him out of the direct line of the investigation. He resigned from his own firm in January, before the news became widely known in their professional community. He and Bethany moved to Nashville in the spring, which is where people in my family's social circle apparently go to start over. My parents sold the house in April. They moved to a smaller property 2 towns over, which my mother told me when she called to give me the address, felt more honest. I did not know what to do with that phrase. I kept it the way I kept things. Marcus flew in from Austin 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, not because I asked him to but because he wanted to. We had dinner at a restaurant in the city, the kind of place neither of us would have chosen a few years ago, and he let me talk for 2 hours without interrupting except to ask good questions. "So what now?" he said when I had finished. I had been thinking about that. PayVault was approaching a Series D conversation. Our revenue trajectory had accelerated through Q3. There were acquisition conversations beginning, 3 separate strategic buyers, 2 of whom I would not have expected. My equity, if we hit the numbers our projections suggested, was going to represent a life-changing sum within 18 to 24 months. None of that was guaranteed, but the work was real and the foundation was solid, and I had built it with Marcus and our team 1 careful year at a time. "I'm going to keep building," I said. "That's it. That's enough," I said. He laughed. It was a good laugh, the kind that comes from genuine recognition. I had not cried at Thanksgiving. I had not raised my voice. I had not delivered a speech about years of dismissal and the cost of disbelief. I had simply sat at the end of the table and watched the truth present itself, because the truth, when you have spent years preparing the ground for it, does not need your help. It arrives on its own schedule with its own documentation, and it does not require your tears or your anger to land. I thought about my father in the moment after Gerald placed that second folder down. The fork dropping, the sound it made on the plate, the way the whole table held its breath. I had not felt triumph in that moment exactly. What I had felt was something quieter. The particular relief of a person who has carried a weight for so long that they have forgotten what it feels like to set it down. 9 years of being told your reality isn't real. 9 years of keeping records in a folder on a hard drive just in case. 9 years of arriving at tables where the chair was always a little too far from the warmth. The weight was down. I was not going to pick it back up. There is a folder on my desk in my Austin office. Not the hard drive. A physical folder, manila, unremarkable. It contains Gerald Holt's report on me, the verified employment history, the equity documentation, the Forbes recognition, the patents. It also contains, behind a divider, the text messages from Derek telling me to come clean. The voicemails from my father. My mother's careful handwritten card. People ask me sometimes, colleagues, friends, Marcus when he's in a reflective mood, whether I would do anything differently. Whether I would have confronted my family sooner or shared the Forbes article, or brought Marcus to one of those dinners like he offered. I always think about the answer carefully before I give it. The answer is no. Not because the 9 years were comfortable. They were not. Not because I don't carry anything from that period, I do. But because the version of the truth that arrived at Thanksgiving, delivered by a former FBI investigator in a room full of people my father had assembled as his audience, was the only version that could not be argued with, reinterpreted, or dismissed. I had learned enough about my family to understand that any truth I delivered myself could be reframed as defensiveness, as drama, as more evidence of my grip on reality. The truth had to come from outside. It had to come with documentation. It had to come when they had already committed to the stage. My father gave me the stage. He paid $10,000 for it. He invited the audience. He introduced the speaker. I just sat quietly and let the investigator do his job. The folder stays on my desk. Not as a trophy, I am not interested in trophies. But as a reminder of the thing I most want to remember. That the truth, when you build it carefully and protect it patiently, does not need you to fight for it. It fights for itself.